Welcome to the Money to the Masses podcast, putting you in control of your finances. One mic, two idiots, and, according to our latest figures, 3 listeners. Here are your hosts, Damien Fay and Andy Leaks.
Before we start, Andy, I just wanted to say a quick thank you to our podcast sponsors, Money Farm. Now, Money Farm are the largest digital wealth manager in Europe, and they create portfolios of ETFs for their clients. They're incredibly cheap and ideal for somebody who's wanting to get into investing, and perhaps for more experienced investors who don't actually want to run their own money anymore. Now, they will even offer to run the first £20,000 of any of our listeners' portfolio absolutely free if they enter the code MTTM20K into the website at moneyfarm.com. For more information, check out their website. But for now, Andy, let's get back on with the show.
Hello and welcome to episode 131 of the Money to the Masses podcast with your resident expert, as always, Damien Fay, and me, Andy Leaks. Damien, how you doing?
I'm good, Andy. I'm very good. We're in the same room, and we could even high five and people can hear that.
Is that the cheesiest start to any podcast ever?
Yep, we'll probably win an award. No, normally we stare at each other via the means of Skype, but I get to see your lovely face today, Andy.
Yeah, with the editing skills that I have, you wouldn't necessarily know that we're not in the same room, but we genuinely are this week, and we've got a weird sort of smile on our faces because we're catching up on old times, talking about football, and it's time to talk money. What have we got on this week's pod?
Right, on this week's pod, I've got 2. Last week we actually had a break from investing, so this week I'm going to do 2 bits. One of them is actually kind of about me, because there was a forum that was started based around me.
Selfish.
Well, I didn't start it. It was done on Reddit.
Okay.
And so it threw up a couple of good questions, which I'm going to answer today. There's a reader question that I had about knowing whether to use a discretionary fund manager and how to tell if they're any good. So they've asked me to answer that on the podcast, which I will. And the last one is kind of a One Giant Leap podcast inspired piece. And we're doing a lot on people starting new businesses. And it's a great website that is basically a startup graveyard and gives you details of all those startups out there that have failed and why, and the money that's been burnt using them. So it's a really good piece of information, something that's really great to absorb. So we'll cover that one as well.
So that's more of a what not to do kind of thing.
It's a what not to do, but it's by learning by other people's mistakes. That's how you're going to probably or hopefully avoid your own. And we're trying to go through this new phase of inspiring people to follow their dreams. So I thought it was a perfect thing to look at.
Excellent. What should we start with?
Well, shall we? I tell you what we'll do. We'll do an investment piece, the graveyard, and then the investment piece, just to give it a bit of a break. And so the first one, I'm going to read the question out. It's a fairly long-winded question, so I'm going to try and cut it down, so bear with me. So the question is, hi Damien, I was wondering if you could help. I've been contracting in the oil and gas industry. I'm 31. I'm looking to invest £300,000 of my savings long term. Now, my accountant put me in touch with a firm called Tilney, who he has suggested to use as a discretionary fund manager for optimal long-term growth. I have, however, listened to your podcast and advice regarding this approach. I want to limit my time and involvement in the fund management, so this approach does seem to suit me. But I wonder if you can assist, because I have 2 questions. Firstly, do you think this approach to a managed investment portfolio is a good idea, or are the companies simply pushing me down a route that will make them the most money? Secondly, how do I go about selecting an investment company that is likely to result in the highest net growth of my portfolio? There seems to be a lot of companies offering similar services, and to be honest, I'm very lost. And I know you're going to be impressed by the way I read that, but Andy, believe me, edited that to cut out the mistakes.
Don't let them in. Don't let them behind the curtain.
I like to be honest. So just to sum that up, when you invest money, you have various options. You can do it yourself, you can get someone in, and normally that can be a financial advisor. And then what happens, that financial advisor might decide to run the money for you. They might pick funds, they might invest in active funds, passive. But what does also happen is they may recommend a discretionary fund service. So what they do is they say to you, in this case Tilney, give them all your money and they will build something that is hopefully bespoke to you, but they'll do the management, and the financial advisor might sit back and say, what I do is just make sure they're doing a good job. Now, I worked in the city where we dealt with people who had large sums of money, sometimes going into 7 figures. And that was the way they started to do to run money. The financial advisor would farm out the investment process because, to be honest with you, most financial advisors don't have the expertise to go and pick the funds. There are probably about 2,000 funds out there that they could buy or research, and they just don't have the time or expertise to do it. So therefore, they tend to buy from best buy lists, or if the sales guy comes round and sweet talks them or whatever.
And is that not just the sort of the time it takes for the initial input to research it, but is it the ongoing sort of cost of having to constantly review it and do that kind of admin as well?
Yeah, and that's exactly it, because they can do the initial, but things change, and it's not just down to fund managers changing, it's also the environment in which we invest. So you think where we are now in 2017 is very different from where we were, say, in the beginning of 2016. Brexit didn't exist.
China, Greece, or was that the year before?
That was a year before, but we had a bit of Greece still bubbling in the background. Donald Trump wasn't causing problems. So all these things suddenly change the dynamic. And what happens is the portfolios that come off the shelf from the sort of typically the fund platforms or whatever, they're not very dynamic. So what used to happen in the city, they would do what was called a beauty parade. So they would get a very rich client and say, we're going to go and give your money to, say, 6 of these people. So 6 companies like Tilney, give them each 300 grand, because as a financial advisor, they were saying, look, we can't keep up with this and the risks are too high for your sum of money. We're going to find experts, kind of like finding fund managers just for you. But what it is, discretionary fund managers, the discretionary part is that they make decisions on your behalf. So rather than you buy a fund, they just get 300 grand, say, of your money, and they do as they please within a remit that you agree. Now, it's quite a sensible approach, but the difficulty is, which is why this is such a good question, with funds, so normal funds that you and I might buy in our pensions or ISAs, there's information out there, quite limited, but it's out there. It's in the ether. You could do your own research. You can pay for services like I do, and I therefore produce 80/20 Investor to research those things, and you can formulate an opinion. The problem with discretionary services, whereby you just give your money to this company who may have a whole army of people running this money, it's kind of like a black box. Because it's discretionary, the client knows maybe what they're invested in, but you don't know what other clients are doing. So they may have, let's just make round numbers, let's say they have 100 clients, very wealthy clients, and they run their money. They don't publish that data because they don't have one fund. It's not a fund that they run. They just run money on behalf of wealthy people.
Yeah.
So therefore, there is no data out there that's produced. So it makes it very difficult to know who's the best. They're just telling you they're the best. You're not going to go around and talk to all the clients of all the companies because you don't know who they are.
Okay.
So what we used to do there was a company called ARC, Asset Risk Consulting, I think based on the Isle of Man. And they were just a research outfit that just looked at this niche of the investment world, these discretionary managers. And they would go in there.
They were making the discretionary not so discretionary because they were getting the information and putting it out.
Yeah, but how they did it was quite clever.
Right.
What they would do is they'd go in and they'd say to the discretionary manager, give me all the data of how your clients' portfolios have done, and we'll anonymise it. And therefore they create like a scatter chart of how they've done, and based on the risks that they've taken, because don't forget every client might have a slightly different risk profile.
Yeah.
Then they did that for everybody and all of them. And once they got them all on board, they then said, well, what we can do, if you pay us 10, 20 grand a year, we'll give you a report to show you where you sit
amongst all
the others. So it's like a benchmarking of these things, but you don't get individual client data. Now that is what wealthy, really sort of top-end financial advisors can get access to, and they can build panels using it. It costs about, when I was doing it a couple of years ago, about 20 grand to get a panel built. So that's why most financial advisors don't do it. So that accountant who is just pointing them in the direction of Tilney, they have just, obviously they're a big name, and just gone, go and use them, because they didn't want to recommend probably a financial advisor who didn't know he had the expertise, but they obviously didn't know which is the best discretionary manager right now. That's just one they're aware of. But where I'm getting to with all this, there is a glimmer of hope for ordinary investors, because a few years ago, ARC got in touch with me and they were trying to talk about a product to bring it to the market for consumers, because this is obviously their research is for companies to use. It costs a lot of money. And they came up with this idea, suggestus.com. And suggestus.com, that is. And what they did was take the data, that the report, but make a slightly more simplified version, but allow ordinary customers, what they call retail customers, to go on there and put in some data about themselves and then pull up or receive a PDF report that gives them the kind of portfolio they they would probably be put into, and how it rates amongst others. So let's say you have a portfolio, you could put it in there and it could say, well, these discretionary managers would do better. They won't tell you who they are, but they'll tell you where you sit. So you can judge your discretionary manager. And the reason they did it is they wanted people like this guy who gave the question to go to their financial advisor and say, look, I need a discretionary manager. How do you know they're the best one? This is the report. And then the financial advisor would have to go to ARC and use their services. That was the idea. But they wanted to charge people £20 for doing it. And I was a little bit sceptical about whether it'd work. Because of this question, I revisited their site, and it appears that you can now do that for free. They are no longer, because I told them at the time, you can't charge people for this, you've got to do it for nothing. They told me I didn't know what I was talking about. Lo and behold, it seems like it's free. So this is a good example. Go to the website, have a look if you're considering a discretionary manager, and put in your details and your risk profile, and then you can see the sort of returns that they're generating, and you'll get a report. It's not necessarily the most easy report to consume, but bear with it. The other thing is £300,000 is obviously a lot of money, but there are other things you could do. You could run it yourself, which a lot of people do. The people who do 80-20 investor who have more than that might run it, or obviously you get a financial advisor who may pick funds. So hopefully I've answered that question.
Or, of course, you've mentioned a couple of different ways you can invest the money. I did get an email, funnily enough, from a guy from Nigeria who was giving me, he knows Nigerian prince, he's just trying to release some funds for tax purposes. So if you want to get in touch with him, I've got his email address. So.
We shouldn't laugh really, but it is good to bring those things up because you get so many of them. I read a story just before I came on here that was related to not even investing, but eBay. And it then got into somebody sold a computer on eBay, and then they got told they were going to have to send it to the person now was buying it in deepest, darkest. I think it was, I can't remember where it was, in somewhere in the sort of Far East or whatever, that they were going to have to send it to, and it just started to become a scam. So It's one of these things that is always worth reminding people that as soon as things seem slightly out of the ordinary. I remember a few years ago there was that there was a guy who decided to try and get these scammers back at their own game, who started saying he'd send the money if they would pose with a fish on their head and things like that and hold up signs. I can't remember the name of the website, but they obviously did that, the scammers, trying to get the money, not realising they were just being made fools of on the internet. I think the guy got death threats, but what I was going to say is that it just reminds you that if things seem a little bit odd, then they probably are. You should steer clear.
Yeah, we haven't got time to go over it now, but a quick story about my father-in-law. He's involved with a church in Africa, and a guy contacted him saying, have you got any money for me? I need to buy some furniture for my family. And my father-in-law is a generous man. He knows this guy well. He knows the church. He goes over to Africa and does a lot of work with the Smile Project. So he didn't think it anything out of the ordinary for this guy to just be asking for a little bit of a loan. And then the money went up, and then wasn't quite sure what the money was for. And the language in the email was slightly different to what... Anyway, the long story short, he actually contacted the person via a different method, which was WhatsApp or something. And he said, that money you're after, can you confirm exactly? He said, it's not me. Be careful. And what the person had done is infiltrated the email address. And when he looked back at the email address, it had a tiny little dot between the two names. And they'd copied language that they used. They call each other brother, and because they're sort of religious.
Tell you what though, Andy, that is so sophisticated. Because I've...
And they hadn't asked for a stupid amount of money. They asked for about £700, which... because of the charities and things, that's about the amount of money that goes backwards and forwards to help out the project. So,
tell you what, that's a good story because obviously he didn't fall victim of the scam. But just to remind people that if things seem a little bit odd, but that just shows you the sophistication of these things. We talked about one recently where there was something very similar, but to hear an actual case is quite incredible. I mean, anybody would fall for that. The one thing I think about scams is people always feel stupid, and I don't. The thing is, these scams are so sophisticated now that if you become a victim, I don't think you should beat yourself up about it. You can only be so careful. It's like being burgled. There's only so much you can do. And if these people are going to do it and you fall victim, sometimes it's just hard luck.
Yeah, absolutely. Good stuff. Right, startup graveyards.
Yeah, startup graveyard. This is a new site that I've come across that is simply that. If you go to startupgraveyard.io, and it's a website that is pulling together in a very simplistic and very consumable way information about some of the some startups out there. Most of them are American at the moment, and they're building a database of startups that have failed. But not only the fact that they failed, but telling you what they were doing, who founded them, how much money they raised, how many investors they had, but the reasons for failure. And that is the thing that's fascinating to read, because some of the names, I mean, I've gone through them, I don't recognise them, but then you won't necessarily, because a startup that even if it's acquired millions in investment is in its infancy, but they've come up with ideas, it's going to be the next big thing, and they have failed for whatever reason. And I would recommend anybody to go along and read it, and they pull the information, I think, from multiple sources, not just accounts. There's lots of sources, including interviews, etc. And I'm going to just run through a couple of them, because it's amazing how many reasons seem fairly obvious to you in hindsight. But for anybody who's starting even the most simplest venture, it might be on the back of our One Giant Leap podcast, or it may be something you're doing now. It's just a good reminder of how things can very quickly go wrong. And to give you an example, I mean, you may have heard of this one, Andy. It's called Ardio. I think that's how you say it. It's like radio, but without the A. And this one is one of the big ones that was on there. It raised $127 million in 6 rounds of investing with only 4 backers. So there must have been some wealthy individuals in San Francisco. And it was a digital music service, and it was meant to reinvent the way that you listen to music. And it ended up failing because the industry changed as this product was being made. And it's one of those things that you have to try and pivot a business. And it's a good example, because anybody out there who uses Spotify and people like that came along, and they started to very quickly give their services away you can get a free version of a lot of these services, and then they'll be paid for by advertising, although you get subscription models. This one wasn't very quick at having a free version, and so making money from advertising that was built in. The others did, and they attracted more users, so therefore they got a start on it. Spotify very quickly overtook it. One of the recurring themes I've seen in so many of these case studies is that they found it difficult to retain talent, and by that they mean some of the people who worked for them, and so therefore they were being taken by other people. So they might have a really good marketing person in there, and then they go off elsewhere. And they turned into what they ended up doing was trying to mimic other people, and they became a free service with advertising eventually. But the writing was already on the wall, and it was too late, and they'd already stuck to their original vision. And it's this thing that I've read in a number of different places, and Instagram's a very good example of this, where the person pivoted the original idea. It became just about imagery when it first launched. It wasn't so much, and actually made it successful. And they didn't. This example here, this Ardio, didn't have enough different features or anything like that made it any better than anybody else. So it's a good example. But if £120 million can go up in smoke, then it just shows you anything can happen. Now, I didn't know this one. It's called 99 Dresses, and this one was based in Australia and had about $100,000, so it's a much smaller venture. And the idea that it was like a virtual closet, so we'll say a wardrobe, and it allowed people to trade fashion items with other users. So it was kind of using fashion and almost a social networking element that makes it sound like it should work. But ultimately, that failed because the business model was based on taking a percentage of transactions. And as they had to try and encourage people, they took a sort of less and less, like decrease in prices, etc. The amount of revenue they took was hit. And also the technology wasn't up to scratch. So they had a brilliant idea, but ultimately there were reasons why it failed. So go and have a look at it. There's a whole range of these things. And I can't remember the one company where the founder, his vision differed from the other people within the firm. They were just sort of wanting to, they weren't so committed to the idea, and it failed, and it was worth a couple of $100 million at the time. And so it's a great example of looking at reasons why people fail and try and take some of that on board. Because, I mean, when we're doing any businesses like Money to the Masses or anything people out there are doing, is if you look at what other people, you've got to always be honest with yourself when things aren't working and not be too headstrong and stubborn.
I think it's a really good site. I'm looking at it now. It's in clear sort of infographic almost. You've got sort of key points, and what I like about it is along the top there you've got a big coffin. Whenever you click on one of the startups, and straight away you see a big coffin with their name on it. It's not obviously fun to look at people's the demise of people's business dreams, but it is certainly interesting.
I'll have to just mention actually, Andy, what inspired this piece was something called Yik Yak. And I mean, I'm not into social media massively, but it was a social media platform that at one point was valued at over $400 million. And it was meant to be the next big thing. And it allowed people to communicate, say, on campuses and things like that, anonymously. So it was like an anonymous social network. And it got everybody very excited in America. But it sold or closed down this month for a grand total of $1 million, which was effectively paying for some of their intellectual property and some of their tech team. So for something to go from 400 million to almost overnight to be worth nothing is just a great story about how these things can seem to be the next great thing, but then they blow up because of something very simple. And this site that I was talking about has all those sorts of examples on it. But I mean, that is amazing. 400 million be sold for 1 million. There you go.
It's sad, really, that Yickety Yak won't be back. It doesn't even work.
But
it's not
you
even
know what
their
the thing
name.
is, though? These people, it is sad. I hate to see these things happen. But what is interesting is a lot of that money is not their own. It's people like venture capitalists who come along and pump it full of money and hope it will work. And then it doesn't. So it's like investors' money, really. So not necessarily the founders. So there's a lot of people out there who will pump money in, believe in the hype. And unfortunately, it doesn't always work. Before we move on, Andy, I just wanted to quickly mention 80/20 Investor. Now, 80/20 Investor is my DIY investment service. Do go and check it out. I empower and teach people how to invest their own money. The service provides data-driven fund tables. The data is driven by my own unique 80/20 Investor algorithm, which I created. You also get stop-loss alerts, you get research articles and insights, you get market commentaries, monthly commentaries, and DIY investment lessons, but you also get access to my £50,000 portfolio, which is a portfolio of my own money, which I run live on the site for members to see, and it shows people how I use the service to maximise my returns. And in the first 2 years of doing so, I turned £50,000 into £59,500, which is a 19% return, beating investment managers, professional fund managers, financial advisors, investment banks, passive trackers and the market. So everybody can have a free 30-day trial of 80/20 Investor, and you can claim that by going to moneytothemasses.com and going and clicking on the 80/20 Investor hyperlink at the top of the page. So go and try the service. Let me know what you think of it, and I know from the feedback that you're going to love it. But for now, on with the show.
Okay, what we got next?
Well, it's a good lead-in having the ad there about 80/20, because the last piece is around 80/20 Investor, which for those of you who haven't listened before is my DIY investment service, which I teach people how to run their own money and provide them with research and insights to run money. Like that chap earlier, he might want to use something like that, and it's really to help people to be DIY investors. Now, what happened is the other day somebody pointed it out to me and said, have you seen on Reddit there's a bit of a forum that's gone on about 80/20 Investor? And I know there had been one before, and some of the members have actually been very positive on there, obviously, and saying how much they loved it because people were speculating what it was about and stuff like that. So that I'd seen that before, which is wonderful when people seem to have your back and will write about it in such a positive way because they like it. But the latest one was quite interesting because it started to raise the question that people were saying, well, if it's so great, why isn't he retired on a beach if he's been able to outperform the market? Why does he only put £50,000 in it? If it's that great, why isn't he taking a percentage of people's money rather than just doing a subscription fee?
I could answer that for you because I know you're a bloody good bloke, and at the end of the day, your website is called Money to the Masses, so you want to help the masses. You don't want to just be rich off a few. Anyway.
Yeah, but this is the point which, I mean, I don't engage with these things online because I think you should do things because you believe in them and they add value. If they really add value and they are really good, people will like them. And the world of finance doesn't get that, and they work in the way of saying everything they do is perfect and amazing. So my belief is, obviously, there will be people who will write online about they're entitled to ask questions, and there will equally be people who will go on there and sing my praises, probably. But what it raised was an interesting point that I thought I'd answer it. It's a valid question. Like, for example, why do I only invest 50,000? Quite simply, that's all I've got. And the reason is because I'm an ordinary guy, and I have family, run a business, and I don't have to justify what I do. What it does show is that I believe in the process, an 80-20 investor, that I'd put all the money I can into it.
It almost doesn't matter how much it does, because what you're trying to do there is you're trying to show the process by you're looking at the percentages of the money that you can make. So actually 50,000 is arbitrary, I imagine.
Yeah, it's arbitrary because it'd be the same principle if it was 5 million.
Or 1,000.
Or 1,000. And so what we're trying to do is to say to people is that I'm fed up in the world of finance, and where people go, fund managers have a fund and they say it's wonderful. They don't invest their own money in it. There'll be people who are in the newspapers who are commentators about funds, and I know I go in there as well, and people ask my opinion, but I therefore want to back what I say, because you know what, the hardest thing to do, which is why no one does it, is to put your neck on the line and make predictions about things and sit there at a market high just over 2 years ago and then say I'm going to invest the money and then be up nearly 20% I'm proud of that and pleased about it. But you have to do that if you are trying to help people and teach them. You can't just sit there and say, do as I say, because you don't do it yourselves.
You're not going to take diet advice from someone who's 20 stone. Let's be honest. I'm not being, I've been a bigger man myself. I'm just being honest. Yeah. It's that principle.
It is that principle. And one of the things that it's such a brilliant question in a way, because it comes back to this thing that's been ingrained into people's psyche and thought process, which they don't realise, is they're taught that if something is cheap, it's therefore bad. The buy cheap, buy twice mantra doesn't work in the world of finance. Not generally. I mean, there are always going to be exceptions, but I always remember my mum saying that. And it doesn't work that way, because obviously, just give a very simple example. We have passives now, passive investments. Now, if you just want to take that example, not all are great, but there are some fantastic ones and they are quite cheap. The thing is, people charge you and overcharge you because they can get away with it, and it doesn't make it better. I've done the analysis that shows that as you charge more, the performance doesn't increase on a fund. There's a sweet spot. Equally, if you charge less, if it's not a direct relationship between how much something charges and how much money it makes. There's a sweet spot around about 1%, just below that, where there sort of seems to be an optimum. Now, the reason I don't charge a percentage of people's assets is because I don't have any control or insight into their assets. This is a research vehicle where I tell people how to do something. So what would happen in the finance world, they will take your money, say this is the best thing to do with it, and take a percentage of it. Now, it doesn't encourage good outcomes for investors, because they get a percentage of your money no matter what you do. Whether you make money or lose money, they will take a percentage. I've had 80-20 investor members say to me, why don't you do this, Damien? Because you'd make a lot more money and it's that good. You could probably go and you could hopefully one day be sat on the beach. Now, I'm just trying to teach people how to do this, and the subscription model is trying to empower them. Now, I feel that by setting your stall out, by definitely wanting to take a percentage of people's money, you are becoming part of the problem rather than trying to reform the industry. If I want to reform something, I'm not going to go and say, right, I'm going to charge 5% for you to be in it up front of whatever you... That doesn't work. For me, that's just being greedy. Because I've told you on this podcast before, if you invest 100 grand, 300 grand, 500 grand, or 10 grand, the amount of work a financial advisor needs to do is very similar. And they're just basically profiteering by charging you a percentage. And it's a fact. Financial advisors can argue with me if they want, but they'd be wrong. So I don't want to be part of that problem. So to wrap that all up, the reason I've done 80-20 in this way is to teach people. Now, what I'd love, and I do love, is if I get emails from people saying, I'm now loving investing, I've made this amount of money. Of course, they appreciate the fact that I'm not saying they're going to make more money than anybody else out there, or there aren't ever going to be better ways of making money. But this is about time versus expertise. And if you've got very little time and you want a process that is based around momentum, which has been shown to work, and it can optimize your returns, then that is what 80/20 is for. There are so many people who come to me that I would equally say it's not for you, because they want something that is a much more, they want some hand holding, or they want someone to do it for them. And maybe in time, who knows, that I might create something where I could give someone a product where they could do that. But for now, that's not where my time is best spent. So hopefully I answered that. But what it's really getting at, it wasn't I'm not trying to defend what I do. I don't need to. You've got to try and lead from the front. And if you innovate fast enough, you can't hear the detractors, because there's always going to be some. But they're valid questions. But the point I really wanted to hammer home is, don't judge something based on how much it costs. Because if it's expensive, this isn't the Stella Artois world where reassuringly expensive can be used as a slogan to actually say, yeah, it's expensive, so it must be good. In the world of finance, usually if it's expensive, you're being overcharged. That is the simple case. So hopefully I answered that.
Yeah, I get it. It's a sad indictment, really, of how it is right now, that you're providing a service which is, it's cutting through the industry. It's completely different to what anyone else is doing. And people are then going, well, what's the catch? Why isn't he taking more of my money? Why isn't he doing what the other bastards do?
Yeah.
It's almost like saying, if a lady was walking past a building site with men, and those men didn't shout and wolf whistle at her, it's almost like she's then going off to her mates and moaning and saying, what's wrong with them lot? Why didn't they whistle at me? Well, that's how it should be anyway, and we need to change people's attitudes to actually.
Yeah, and that's that's exactly it, Andy. We need to change people's attitudes.
I'm not sure I pulled the right analogy out there, but you know.
No, but I know where you're coming from. But the point is that people need to take away. It's not about believing in what I do. It's about applying the right principles to something wherever you go in finance. It's why people can get scammed. It's why because they will base something upon the idea that in history you overpaid. You don't need to overpay. And because the only way the world of finance works is that they tell you that what they have is the holy grail and they are the best at running your money, and therefore all you need is me. When somebody turns around and says that's not the case, they sit there and go, that's slightly odd, because they're not expecting it. But that's great, because that's what we are going to reform the finance industry. So there we go, Andy. That's me done for this week.
Good. Okay, and so all that's left for us to do is to say, please, if you enjoyed the podcast, do review it. I know we say it every week, but it really helps us out. Gets us higher up in the charts. It means that Damien, with his good work that he does, can help more people for free.
Yeah, and as ever, we've got another One Giant Leap podcast come out this week, and this week's one is a brilliantly simple idea. And comparing it to those startups that are in that graveyard, this one certainly isn't. There's a chap who created the free Postcode Lottery, Chris. Interesting guy. Very simple principle of idea is that you go online, you enter for free, just put your postcode in and that's your ticket, and you can go back every day and potentially win about £700. What happened is, if you listen to the interview, how he came up with the idea, it's amazing. And the fact that his business has been valued at £10 million is also incredible. So the best ideas do not have to be overly complex. It's about keeping things simple, Andy. That's today's message.
Yeah, absolutely. My personal favourite, so do check it out, One Giant Leap podcast. My personal favourite, just because it's that out of the box type thinking. He was riding, won't give too much away, but was riding to work and the idea came to him when he was listening to a radio station. And it's just the sort of thing that I do. I lose myself going off with these dream ideas, and I haven't made one of them yet, but Chris has inspired me that one day it will happen.
Yeah, and that was very gracious of you, Andy, because you technically were episode number 8, I think. So
yeah, I preferred his more than mine.
For you to say somebody else was your favourite and it wasn't you, that's very gracious of you. Yeah. So we've got one more episode left of the series after this week, and then hopefully demand and everything will bring back a second series, and we may even do a special bonus episode for the One Giant Leap subscribers. So please do go and subscribe. Even if you don't listen to it, subscribe to that podcast as well, because it will drive it up the charts.
Absolutely. So One Giant Leap, search for it in iTunes. It's coming to the end of the season. Please do get involved with that. Oh, have we mentioned about getting in touch with you?
No, get in touch with me, Damien at moneytothemasses.com. Twitter is the usual, money2 with the number 2, money to the masses.
Until next week.
Until next week, Andy.
Don't forget to claim your free copy of Damien's best-selling book, The 30-Day Money Plan. Sort your finances in just 5 minutes a day, worth $4.99. Just go to moneytothemasses.com/podcast to find out how.